State Department report is incomplete. And information that is incomplete is wrong. Totally wrong. And there is a big difference between this report and the report of 1991, 1992, and 1993. We would like to know what is the position of the State Department on this issue today. We know that the US ambassador has been very much criticized for her actions. Here is a petition. And there is no faith at all today on the US ambassador in Mauritania. I would like to make it clear for the record. We are human beings and we deserve respect. We are willing to work with the Arab Berbers in our country. But we do not want to be slaves. We do not be ethnically cleansed. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are today deported by this government.
Mr. Chairman.
And close to 500 people have been killed in jails. And the people who killed them have been promoted. They are in the government. What to do with all these international laws? What is doing the United Nations? This is my response to this.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think...
I will ask you to just hold that thought until Dr. Jacobs, then I'll gladly...
Yes, just 2 points. Mr. Dymally was asked about torture, and he said that he didn't think, that they told him that they didn't torture people. I spoke to people in Amnesty International who told me that in 1990, 1991, there was a massive ethnic cleansing of the free blacks in the South. The free blacks in the South are in resistance to the slavery and to the oppression by the Arabo-Berbers. They had the only fertile farmland left after the droughts, and they were pushed across the Senegal River into Senegal, and blacks, Africans in the army and in the civil service were jailed and tortured. And people in Amnesty International who witnessed this said it was the worst that they'd ever seen. In fact, there is a man in this audience, and we hadn't, there's a man in this audience who was an army captain, a Mauritanian black, and who has, in audiences in Harlem and in Brooklyn, taken off his shirt to show the tortures that were done to him. And perhaps Mr. Dymally ought to take a look at that before he goes back to work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't know that I was on trial here. And neither did I know Ambassador Sampers was on trial. Some of the people who signed that petition are refugees who seek to become political refugees so they can obtain asylum in the United States. And they're unhappy about that. That's all I need to say. I am simply here to express a point of view, not to criticize anybody's testimony or to deny it. Simply to let you know that this is a matter which I take up at least twice a year when I go to Mauritania, expressing congressional unhappiness with this subject. I think the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, the chairman of the subcommittee would tell you, I have brought delegations so that they can express their unhappiness to these delegations.
Please, it's very important. I'd like to add, I appreciate what Mr. Donnelly said, because what he's saying is very informative. I spent 4 days in the refugee camps, living and sleeping in them along the river, and interviewed numbers of people. This is the consensus amongst the leaders and the people, that Madame Sampas, as they call her, is the one who is really working for the government of Mauritania. They feel that Madame Sampas is the person who takes the government's view. Whenever they're in conversations with her, they speak like Donnelly. Because...
He's the ambassador of Trinidad.
Excuse me, your name, sir.
Dymally.
Dymally, I'm sorry. They speak like Dymally. In other words, when they say this is happening to us, she says, but the President Talia, I met with him, and this is what he told me. Whenever they bring up issues, this is what she does. She espouses the governmental view. So I had that particular data recorded as to how they view her, how they are distrustful of her and afraid of her because they feel she is behind a movement to get them to send them back to Mauritania. Now the thought is that she's alleged to have said that they are interested in staying there. This sort of voices the gentleman's sentiments, that they are staying there because they get free food or they want a shot at the United States. These people, as if you remember the New York Times article, go down to the river and stare across the river at their farms, at people who own their cattle now. They had villages, they were businessmen, they were prosperous people. They were working hard, their centers of commerce were in the South. How is it suddenly they have now great massive character defects, and now they want to be lecherous and to live off of the crumbs that they live on? I went to desolate, lonely, with no electricity, places far out into countryside. They don't want to stay there. They would like to go across the river back to where it was lush and where they had their farms. So this is a common thing for representatives of that government, even representatives from our government, to say, what does Taya say? This wasn't just voiced by people who were refugees. I also have a recorded record of the widows. Now, the Widows is an organization of women whose husbands, whose sons, whose brothers were tortured to death and murdered. And they have been constantly going to the U.S. ambassador, and she told them in an interview, well, forget about this right now. Life is like that. Don't push things. They don't trust her either. By that time, I was in Mauritania. So the feeling is that the United States is in harmony with the slavery because she espouses and voices whatever they tell her to voice. The problem again here is this. The anti-slavery organizations, which are not recognized by the government. Now we have to ask ourselves, why would a country interested in ceasing the aspect of slavery not recognize two organizations who have files on slavery and whose main agenda, risking their lives because they're a small percentage of this free slave population, not dominated? Why would they not be part of any governmental arrangement to monitor the government's progress, to give them suggestions as to how to do this? They're not monitored, they're not involved because relationships are being developed between the former slaves and Negro Africans. This would unify the country. And because these coalitions are being made, these two groups who have not been co-opted and given big salaries to stop their discussion on this issue are now working with the Negro Africans on a coalition against slavery. This is another important point in terms of understanding what truth is. Haratines have been responsible for the murder of 1,000 Negro Africans. So in their minds, who are these Haratines who have been under control of the Arabs for centuries that we should trust them? But the issue of slavery is so great in their minds in terms of humiliation of their people, in terms of a system of apartheid, that they're coming together. So the government won't involve them. This is important. How can, again, the United States of America, my country, with the knowledge of a Freedmen's Bureau, with universities that train researchers and know how to do interviews, know how to take numbers, know how important it is to have observers, how is it that the State Department would move over 90,000 and arrive at the word vestige? This is causing black Africans in that country to feel one thing. A powerful, bright, resourceful country able to make a move like that has another agenda. Is that agenda now that Iraq is no longer having trouble, the relationships were supposedly broken between Mauritania and Iraq, that now that this has happened, we're not going to be that concerned and we will now shift our policy? This might not be true, but it's in the minds of the suppressed in that country that they have cases, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chairman, Chairperson, Madam Chairwoman, that can be pulled out, the people can be traced, their families can be traced. They have, especially this woman here, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, has 5 children who are in slavery right now. If the State Department wants to contact her, she'll tell them what families they're with, what area they're in, and who is renting them now. So I wanted to add that because his dialogue helps us to appreciate that it's the government's position. Once they give it, U.S. government officials or their representatives say, "Thank you, Ms. President Taya," and they walk away.
Mr. Cotton, thank you for those comments. Before I yield to the chairwoman of the African Subcommittee, one of the biggest concerns we have on this subcommittee is the whitewashing of crimes and the belittling of crimes against humanity, and certainly slavery fits that definition. Last year, we had a hearing, series of hearings on the country reports on human rights practices, and one of the more telling comments by Amnesty International was that in this administration, human rights have been an island. No connection to policy. Very often the statement is relatively, the country reports are relatively accurate, but when it comes down to linkages to policy, it's not there, which means it's an exercise in just exposing something and then doing nothing. In the case of Mauritania, this rewriting this apparent rewriting of the reality, and we are going to delve much further into this on both of these subcommittees, raises the specter of misinforming as well, and becoming part of the government fronting of these atrocities. You know, Mr. Dymally, you said you were not on trial. You are the government spokesman here, representing the government. I don't think it's fair to say that you're acting in a neutral position or just a conduit of information back and forth, which is why I asked you before what your sources of information are. Like a good reporter, we always want to know, what are the sources? Where is it coming from? And the government is just spoon-feeding information, and there's a give and take back and forth. The victims aren't served by that process. I would
Chairman,
let me just finish, and then I'll be happy to yield to you. I would hope, and perhaps you can agree to it right here, that you would join people like Mr. Cotton and others and visit ladies like the lady that he has described here and talk to her, and then represent to the government what the information is that you're finding. Because very often our country reporting on human rights practices falls far below a standard of really trying to seek out the unvarnished truth. And if we buy into some fiction, shame on us as Americans and as Congress. And this is bipartisan. You know, the gentleman from New Jersey, my good friend Mr. Payne, has been outspoken on this, and for which we are all indebted. These human rights abuses anywhere in the world, I don't care who comes and makes presentations for them, we need to expose them and try to mitigate and hopefully eradicate them. And so let's stand in solidarity with the victims. I urge you to go to the refugee camps and talk to people other than just the government, and perhaps accompany some of these people who can really direct you to the real, the victims.
I said before, I welcome your remarks. We'll take it back to the appropriate authorities. I still insist I am not on trial here. I'm an advocate, but
it is the government's policies that are being scrutinized here, and you are the representative.
I have no problems with your criticism. Mervyn Dymally, is not on trial. That's all I said. Period. We may disagree on that, but I am not on trial. Let me say this to you, that I plan to do just that. My role is not all-inclusive. There are human rights groups which do what they do very well. My role is to do what they don't do. That is to take the message to the proper authorities as often as I can, and I do it at least twice a year. And I do not go there without meeting with the chef de cabinet and expressing to him congressional concerns, what the Congressional Black Caucus thinks, what the chairman, how strongly he feels about this, what the African American community feels, what the media is saying. That is my role. And I don't go there apologizing, but trying to get them to shift in an area that would reconcile their differences with the United States government and the Congress. That's all. That is the role I play. Now, I plan to expand my role to do exactly what you suggest. This July, I will spend approximately 3 or 4 weeks there and visit the camps and the refugees in the rural areas. I've done quite a bit of it, and I've done a lot of meetings. So I am not defending what these men are saying or criticizing. I'm simply saying I have a particular role. Each one of us has a role. You are not a member of the New Jersey legislature, you're a member of Congress. And the legislature takes care of problems and the city councilmen take care of potholes. I take care of the Congress. I go back to Mauritania and I said, the Congress is very unhappy. I took a delegation to meet the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, and he only saw you because he's my personal friend, because he's so unhappy about the situation there. I try to impress upon them as often as I can the unhappiness in Congress. But I will expand my role.
Do you agree with the State Department's assessment that slavery has virtually disappeared in
Yes.
Mauritania? You do. Have you heard anything today that would cast some doubt on that? Did
Yes.
you hear anything new today?
Yes.
I appreciate that. Mr. Payne.
Thank you very much. Let me thank the panel for your testimony. And as it was indicated, I received a delegation from Mauritania since I had been so outspoken and had a panel at the Congressional Black Caucus dealing with the problems, particularly in Mauritania. And I did ask that time if there could be some proclamation from the government to reaffirm its opposition to slavery and to make some declarations that would show that the government opposed covert slavery, as we talked earlier, the de facto as opposed to de jure. But to this day, I have not seen or have had anything sent to me that says that they have taken some action on that. And so I would just like to ask Mr. Dymally what has happened to that request, and if in fact they have made some progress on that.
Subsequent to your meeting with the President of the Senate, I took them to Dakar, Senegal to influence that decision, met with the President, met with the Chef de Cabinet, Minister of Foreign Affairs, expressed your concern, which I share. I have been urging them to set up a bureau, a commission, an office. I think I have succeeded them in moving to the point of holding a conference this fall to which we will invite members of Congress and pro-Africa groups. I have submitted the names of just about every pro-Africa group I can think of to attend this conference. And so we're moving this slowly. But I must admit that they have a philosophical problem, a philosophical difference with you. They believe that since they declared that slavery ended, it would be admitting that you're still beating your wife to set up a bureau. It would be like calling upon Congress to implement the 13th Amendment. That has been their response, but I have consistently urged them to change that position, and I hope that this spring we will have begun in that direction, and that your presence there or members of the Congressional Black Caucus will influence that final decision.
I'm glad that there's continued discussion, but you see the whole denial question, problems can never be solved, and although you say it would be an admission, there is a denial that vestiges still remain, and until it's like any kind of illness, unless you recognize you have a problem, then you can't deal with the problem. If you deny that there is indeed a mental health problem or any kind of substance problem or even a physical problem of health, if you deny it and don't take that to the proper authorities to look at it, then nothing will happen. If the government philosophically feels it's an admission that there's still vestiges of slavery, if indeed they did some proactive work, then the situation is not going to get any better. The economic situation is not improving to the degree that people then can motivate themselves to move out on their own once this invisible hand is still over them and these invisible strings are still holding them. They say, well, you're free. No one's going to prevent you from leaving. But by the same token, as I indicated before, in 1863, when slaves in the United States were freed, they looked out and said, free to go where? At least there's a leaky roof here, and the option is across the street, sleeping in the woods somewhere. And so the government set up the Bureau to assist the freedmen and change the law so that they could vote. And in 1868, after the Freedmen's Bureau was formed in 1865 and 1868, as a matter of fact, former slaves gave Grant the overwhelming vote of over 90% of the 450,000 who voted, and Grant won the election of president by 300,000 votes. It was actually the former slaves, because Grant lost the white vote, actually. And so it was because of a concerted effort on the part of the United States government to say, you are free, these are your rights, this is how you do it, this is what we say the steps are, this is how a business is run, this is where you can go, this is what we would provide some direction. There was a concerted effort. Of course, we're talking, 100 years ago, 125 years ago, and so if it's not even recreating the wheel, I could get Library of Congress, to give you the Freedmen's Bureau legislation to take back with them. I mean, if they need some kind of a framework. But if in fact they're going to continue to deny that there is indeed a need for this, then the problem is going to continue. It's going to worsen. People's rights are not going to be heard, and the problem is not going to go away. And the only way that we will be able to, I think, send a message is that we have to then have stronger policies towards Mauritania and other countries that refuse to move in the right direction. And I think it is an obligation, a responsibility, an obligation for our Congress to have more stringent legislation directed to countries that, whether it's philosophical or whatever the reason, are not working. They can do what they want to do, but they can't do it with our support and the support of other world bodies that would normally be involved in attempting to move this along. And so, there are so many unanswered questions, even in the human rights reports. They still talk about the government is not forthcoming in addressing the vestiges of slavery, and it's talked about in Section 6C, and that favors the discrimination laws favors individuals on the basis of ethnic and tribal affiliation, social status, and political ties. These things are and of course, the traditional maltreatment. We haven't even gotten into the question of women, which are just really mistreated in so many ways. That's a whole other area. We realize it's a complicated and complex country, but if the nation itself decided that it wanted to move into the 21st century and move out of the dark passes of former years, they could do it. And I think that we will have a responsibility to keep the pressure on Mauritania and on Sudan and any other country where we see continued violation of human rights, and it's a responsibility of this body to do that. I mean, there are no questions. If slavery was ended, what kind of compensation was done? No one knows what happens. What happened to the 90,000 people who were slaves and all of a sudden they were decreed free? Where did they go? Where is that whole body of people? There's so many unanswered questions. You therefore assume that it's illogical to think that they have dispersed. And indeed, they are, in fact, primarily still in the situation that they were in several years ago.
Mr. Payne.
Yes.
So powerful were your words. When I went there, I convened a meeting of the opposition and asked a specific question. If the government opens up a bureau against slavery, would you oppose it? And the answer was no. Would you criticize the government? No. Mr. Chairman, each one of us plays a different role. My role is a different role from these gentlemen here. My role is to push the government as a result of congressional sentiment. That is how I see my role. And after the meeting with Mr. Payne, I went back there, convened a meeting, and the chair of the Africa Subcommittee, and met with the opposition and the media, and asked that specific question. Would you oppose a bureau against slavery? The answer was no, and I took that message back to the government, and I will take it again when I go back in July or probably before. And that's what I do. In a way, I'm on their side trying to clear this question up, but in a different way. They wouldn't listen to me if I went there calling them pigs.
Can I add something? Mr. Dymally said earlier that these petitioners do want to have political
I said
asylum.
some. I didn't say all.
Pardon?
Said some.
How do you know that?
I have my sources, as you do.
No. These people want to go back to Mauritania. They don't want to go back. They don't want to come here as political asylees. They are farmers. They are living in their country for generations. All they know is Mauritania, that land that we call Mauritania. Whether the government wants it or not, they are from that country. And now the Mauritanian government is trying to fool the international public opinion by sending here an ex-slave as a Mauritanian ambassador. I think that is just an insult to the intelligence of the American public. The real question is how to solve the problem of slavery in Mauritania. This is the real question, but not sending just one person who's going to come here with a mission of saying, look, I'm a former slave, and if I can't be a diplomat, an ambassador, then there is no slavery in Mauritania. This is the kind of thing that we are going to have, and really, we just want to reject that nomination of an ex-slave who is working for the government to just not go straight to the real problem of solving the problem of slavery in Mauritania. And there are many more. I don't trust the Mauritanian government to hold a Freedmen Bureau. This government is not credible. First, they killed all these people, 500 people in jail, and thousands tortured. And then they deported close to 100,000 people, and they still have this institution of slavery, and it's only the government that can do it. But this is not the government that is going to solve the problem in Mauritania. Not this government of Colonel Maoul Sid Ahmed Taya, who was siding with Iraq against the United States. This is somebody who does not believe in democracy. He does not have any respect for human beings. The black who are there are just for him slaves. This is the real situation. I don't think even if we have a Freedmen Bureau with this government, it's going to be another way to control the slaves, but not to free them. Thank you.
I'd just like to add a recommendation to the committee. This country must be understood in terms of slavery as a nugget existing in a universe of an apartheid, a differentiated form. When we think about it, the Negro Africans have endured humiliation, racism, deprivation because of their race, murder of the worst forms, brutalization. They have lived this while slavery revolves in the middle. So it's important to recognize that if the United States sends people to understand, all respects due to my friend, all respects due to my associate here on the panel, Mr. Dymally, they would not trust him, just like a Jewish person who saw someone come from Himmler's cabinet to talk to them about and to ask them for information on people, they would not do that. If I would not have been allowed in a safe house to look at a woman running from her master if they knew the next day I was having dinner with Taya. So when we approached this, my research was successful because an African American who had Fulani features could go and put on the clothing of the people and live in the community, live in the refugee camps, and just talk and walk and record. I didn't represent a threat to them. I had spent a year making contacts here so I could be vouched for when I arrived. So we must also recognize that when these people think about going back, they're thinking about returning to a period of time of nightmares, of rapes, of being shot to death, thrown in the river to drown. And that's what they do. They go to the river and they look over to their land. I did not observe anyone saying that they wanted to come back here. They want to go back there, but they have no guarantees from the government for protection. Their land has been given to Tuaregs, who came with their own slaves from Mali. So what happens? Since the whole aspect of slavery is based on the fact of complete economic deprivation, humiliation of the subject, being a beat from birth, if you've taken now the proud people who had their lands, who had their farms and their cattle, who had commerce back and forth from the river, you've taken that all from them, killed their families, promoted the people who murdered them. Now, with nothing and they're destitute, you ask them to return. Who, therefore, is returning? Someone just one notch away from complete subservience who will ever give them something to eat or work at. It is important to understand that this is the process of ethnic cleansing and the breaking and the humiliation of a black race of people. If they are forced to return because they will be starved in Senegal, those who return, you simply have to use your imagination. Those who return are activists who've been voicing things against the government, who have families there. So this wanting to return is based on requirements. Will you guarantee us protection? Who will watch for us? You know, sir, rapes are still going on in the villages across the river. There's a gendarmerie that still runs around with former slaves at their command that beat people, shoot people. It's not at the frequency it was before, but they know because the traffic is going back and forth across that river what's happening inside. So when we talk about the United States government being part in a push to go back to your land now, Senegal, saying, hey, you can't have refugee status, go back home. We're asking people, and I'd like to make this, and like to say this is analogous to, asking people who escaped from Ashfaz and Dhaka and say, look, we're sorry, come back home. If this understanding is not clear, we will not be working the problem from the standpoint of the people. If you'll notice, human rights organizations that went to, and I appreciate Freedom House, I've worked with them, but when Freedom House went, 2 white men went. 2 white men. How are white men going to blend in the community and see and talk to people? The moment they hit the communities, who are these white men and who are they connected with? Well, they're staying in the hotel and they're also working with the U.S. ambassador. That's the kiss of death. And they're also working with the government. So African Americans or Africans who cannot be compromised, oh my God, if we can find these things, should be sent on a mission of fact-finding with the ability to move to and fro. As you know, and I don't think this was answered honestly, the London Anti-Slavery Organization, please call Michael Dottridge of that organization, is not permitted. They're the ones who came in after the 1980 edict and said, look, you said it's over, but we count 100,000 plus 300,000 part-time. So this is something that must be understood. The last point for psychological understanding is this. The people in that country have been raised for centuries to listen to their masters. I don't know how important this is to the State Department because they seem to go over this point. We all know of a woman or a child who's been incested from the time they're 2 years old, and that father can walk over to that child and incest them at 16 years old. Even if the child runs away, the father can walk over to the child and say, "Come on, baby, we're going home." That child will go home with him. That wife who's been brutalized will go home with him. This is a people raised at the level of animals. They will run away, they will think about it, they hear their master's voice. I was told that even Haratines that I was working with and helping, if their master asked them about me, that I was there, they would freely tell them. So please allow individuals who understand from the side of the oppressed their psychosocial condition, their conditioning for hundreds of years, the power of that government, the fear of living in a terrorist nation. I'm talking about terrorism on their own people. This must be taken and be understood. So we could say to this gentleman here, Dymally, go and talk to them. I'll tell you who they see when he comes to them. These things must be taken into consideration. If not, we're being totally insensitive to a very brutalized people as to asking them, open up to us, tell us, give us key people. Let us talk to people who are hiding. What's their names? Take me to the safe houses. And then after this is over, let's say, after we all go home and the cameras go off, and it's nighttime, and I was there at nighttime, then there are headlights. Then people disappear. Then people are beaten to death. So after we go home from Selma, Alabama, on a voter's registration drive, those people have to live there. And we have to be very cognizant of that if our motive is to uproot this centuries-old heinous activity and also approach these people in a way that can be therapeutic and helpful to them. And that's my recommendation.
Mr. Cotton, thank you for that very eloquent and sophisticated read of the situation, which I think is necessary. Otherwise, in my view, we're talking about a Potemkin village, where people go and they see and they really don't see. And I would urge Mr. Dymally, with all due respect, to really take back the message of our concern, Democrats and Republicans of this subcommittee, and the gentlelady from Florida, that more scrutiny, not less, more concern, not less, will be brought to bear on these issues. We heed the insights of our distinguished panel, and I know I'm most grateful for what you've done this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You can be assured I will.
Very short, because the next panel needs to get on underway.
Thank you very much. You can be assured I will take back the message.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'd like to, again, thank this panel and invite the third panel, if they would, come to the witness table. Meanwhile, I would ask Congressman Frank Wolf if he would join us. Mr. Wolf has been a leader on behalf of human rights around the world. He and I have traveled to many countries, but he has undertaken 3 trips to the Sudan, has spoken out very boldly on behalf of human rights, both in country as well as here in the United States. And I'd ask him if he would come and join us for this next panel. And I would ask Congresswoman Ros-Lehtinen if she would introduce our panel.
Bíró sit next to Lady Cox. Okay, great. Thanks.
We welcome the panelists who will be appearing before us. Baroness Caroline Cox, Deputy Speaker of the House of Lords; Gáspár Bíró, Special Human Rights Rapporteur to the United Nations; Kevin Vigilante, Clinical Associate Professor of Medicine, Brown University School of Medicine; and Augustine Lado, President of Pax Sudani. Baroness Caroline Cox is a board member of the United Kingdom branch of the Christian Solidarity International, a human rights organization working for victims of repression worldwide. She has visited Sudan on behalf of this group many times, most recently in January of this year, and 3 times the previous year, obtaining first-hand evidence of human rights violations from former slaves, families with enslaved relatives, and survivors of malicious slave raids. The evidence which she will present today will be based on these first-hand accounts of modern-day slavery. We thank you for that. I will read the introduction to our other panelists. Mr. Gáspár Bíró. Mr. Bíró is a United Nations Special Rapporteur on Sudan since his appointment in 1993. Mr. Bíró has made 2 trips to Sudan and several trips to neighboring countries to investigate human rights abuses. He has been banned from Sudan since 1994 after his first report to the UN prompted the Sudanese government to label him worse than Rushdie for his satanic report. He has published several reports since then. Dr. Kevin Vigilante is representing the Puebla Institute, a private human rights organization based here. Dr. Vigilante has spent 10 days in Khartoum, Sudan last year on a human rights fact-finding mission. 2 years ago, he was included in Time magazine's list of the top 50 leaders of the future under the age of 40 and received 46% of the vote when he ran for the House of Representatives in Rhode Island's District 1. He graduated from Cornell University Medical School and completed his residency at Yale. Dr. Augustine Lado was born in South Sudan and is now a refugee living in the U.S. He is chairman of the Coalition Against Slavery in Mauritania and Sudan and president of Pax Sudani, a human rights organization campaigning against slavery in Sudan. In addition to publishing several articles on slavery and genocide in Sudan, Dr. Lado organized a symposium on the subject and has made presentations at the Abolitionist Conference at Columbia, the Sudan Association Conference in Boston, and at an Amnesty International-sponsored conference on the plight of indigenous peoples. We welcome all of the panelists, and we will begin with Baroness Cox.
Madam Chairman, thank you for this invitation to give evidence this afternoon. As you have said, my evidence is based on first-hand experiences obtained during 8 visits to Sudan over the past 4 years. 6 to southern Sudan, including 2 to the Nuba Mountains, 1 to the north to meet the government and to visit territories controlled by the government, and 1 to the Eritrean Sudanese borderlands. The visits are sponsored by Christian Solidarity International, or CSI, a human rights organization working for victims of repression regardless of their creed, color, or nationality. We focus particularly on people cut off from major humanitarian organizations, such as United Nations organizations or the International Committee of the Red Cross, as those organizations can only visit places with the permission of a sovereign government. Being independent, we can go to people who are denied access by those organizations, by their governments, and therefore we can meet people who are bereft of aid and also of the advocacy that goes with aid. Reference to that word independence reminds me that I must emphasize that I am not speaking on behalf of the British government, but on behalf of CSI. On the basis of eyewitness evidence and of first-hand accounts, we testify to gross violations of human rights inflicted by and or encouraged by the government of Sudan, including widespread and systematic slavery of men, women, and children. Government troops and government-backed Popular Defense Forces, or PDF, regularly raid black African communities for slaves and other forms of booty. The slaves, in most cases children and young women, are taken north, where they are forced to provide domestic and agricultural labor and sexual services against their will, for nothing other than a minimum of food for survival. Those who are Christians are generally given Muslim names and forced to observe Muslim rituals. Some boys are forced to attend Quranic schools or PDF training camps, where they are trained to wage war against their own people. We offer sources of evidence from 3 regions in Sudan. First, in northern Bahr Ghazal. We have stayed on 3 occasions in the town of Niamlel and walked to surrounding villages and to the market town of Maniel, where Arab traders bring back slaves to sell them to their families. We have met many people who have been enslaved as chattel slaves, who have escaped or been bought back by the Arab traders. We've taken their testimonies, which are published in the accompanying documentation. We have also spoken to the Arab traders, who have described in details how they bring back and abduct women and children from the north to sell them back to their families, for sums of money, averaging 5,000 Sudanese pounds per slave, or for goods such as livestock. The average price per slave is 5 head of cattle. We have also seen the evidence of barbarities perpetrated during the slave raids by government and PDF forces against black African towns and villages. We have seen the scars caused by torture of men and women, especially the elderly, who are not taken as slaves. We've seen the evidence of looting, pillaging, and the destruction of buildings, including homes, churches, and clinics, and the burning of crops. In the second area, in the Nuba Mountains, we have met women and children who had been detained in so-called peace camps organized by the government or in government garrisons. Some had been captured in military attacks on their villages. Others had been forced to go to government-controlled areas to seek food or medicines for survival. Once there, they were forced to renounce their Christian names, to adopt Muslim names and practices, and were subjected to sexual abuse and forced labor. Again, detailed case studies of these are published in our accompanying documents, which have been circulated. In the third area, the Eritrean Sudanese borderlands, we have met boys and young men belonging to the Muslim Badger people who gave evidence of their abduction and enforced conscription in the government army to fight against the peoples of the south and the Nuba Mountains. We have personal testimonies from those who have been captured for this purpose, but who have managed to escape. In all places we have visited, both Christian and Muslim community leaders, civil administrators, professional personnel, and military commanders have given us detailed accounts of violations of human rights by the government of Sudan, as part of their policies of subjugation of the people of the south and the Nuba Mountains, including systematic slavery and forced labor, the use of hunger to force people to leave their homes to seek food, and the manipulation of aid as a means of enforced Islamization of non-Muslims. These policies need to be seen in the wider context of other violations of human rights perpetrated by the regime, including ground and aerial offensives against civilians. Overall, 1.5 million people have died and over 5 million been displaced in the recent years of this civil war. And it must also be remembered that the government is oppressing many Muslim people in the north, both the Muslim Badger people and other Muslims who oppose the regime in Khartoum. During our visit to northern Sudan and also to Cairo, we have taken evidence from many Muslims who have suffered unlawful arrest, detention, maltreatment, and severe torture at the hands of the regime in Khartoum. I finish, if I may, by offering 3 conclusions and 4 recommendations. The first conclusion: the government's policy towards the people of the south and the Nuba Mountains is tantamount to genocide by means of terror, war, slavery, the mass displacement of the population, and the manipulation of aid. And in particular, widespread systematic slavery continues on a large scale in government-controlled areas of Sudan. Secondly, the raids by government troops and government-backed PDF militia against African towns and villages of the south and the Nuba Mountains are accompanied by atrocities, by the capture of men, women, and children for slavery, by torture, rape, looting, and destruction of buildings and property. Those not taken into slavery are generally killed and or tortured. And thirdly, humanitarian aid fails to reach hundreds of thousands of victims of war and famine. The government continues to refuse to give access to the UN and to NGOs, to SPLA-administered areas in the Nuba Mountains, and to many areas in the south. This denial of access by aid organizations causes massive suffering and is used to create hunger as a weapon in its policy of enforced migration, which facilitates its program of enslavement and forced labor. The recommendations: we believe the time has come for the international community to take a firmer stand against the government's policies of slavery and genocide in the broader sense, involving destruction of life, culture, language, community, religion, and ethnic identity. CSI therefore calls on the international community, and in particular on the member states of the United Nations Security Council, to build on the recent United Nations Security Council resolution, and in the event of failure by the government of Sudan to comply with the conditions of that resolution, to consider a range of sanctions, from denial of visas to the imposition of oil and arms embargoes. We also call on the international community to prevail upon the government of Sudan to cease hostilities against civilians in the south and the Nuba Mountains, to honor its voluntarily accepted human rights obligations to all its citizens, to allow access for human rights monitors to all areas of Sudan under the direction of the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Sudan. These monitors could investigate the extent of slavery and other violations of human rights. If the regime in Khartoum has nothing to fear, it should have no reservation about allowing such access. And to allow access to all parts of Sudan by humanitarian aid organizations, and to allow the international community to direct aid to the no-go areas. Finally, Madam Chairman, CSI also urges the international community to support the IGAD Declaration of Principles calling for the right of self-determination, secular government and democracy, and to support Sudan's democratic opposition groups, which represent over 90% of the population, and to encourage the National Democratic Alliance as it seeks to develop policies to promote peace and justice for all people in Sudan, including the abolition of slavery. Madam Chairman, unless the international community succeeds in preventing the government of Sudan from continuing its brutal programs and policies, the tragedy, which is already of catastrophic proportions, will escalate even further and mean yet more horrific suffering for the peoples of Sudan. This tragedy will certainly create a bottomless pit of need for humanitarian aid and may also cost the international community a high price in terms of political instability. Thank you very much.
Baroness Cox, thank you very much for your testimony. Dr. Bíró.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I wish to begin by emphasizing how honored I feel to be here before this distinguished body and to provide testimony.
Bring the, thank you.
To provide testimony regarding my findings on the situation of human rights in the Sudan, in particular forms of contemporary forms of slavery and practices similar to slavery. Mr. Chairman, since 1993, when I have undertaken my mandate as a Special Rapporteur of the UN Commission on Human Rights, I received numerous reports and information and collected dozens of eyewitness testimonies indicating that contemporary forms of slavery, including the slave trade, forced labor, and servitude, are widespread and systematic practices condoned and tacitly approved by the government of the Sudan. I would like to share with you some of the evidence that I discovered supporting this conclusion. Different paramilitary units are fighting together with the army in Southern Sudan and the Nuba Mountains area. These paramilitary units include the Popular Defense Forces, the PDF, created in November 1989, include groups of volunteers called Murahelin, and include Arab tribal militias armed and controlled by the government of the Sudan. Numerous reports and testimonies received during my missions to the Sudan and some neighboring countries with hundreds of thousands of Sudanese refugees indicate that members of these groups are carrying out systematically abductions of civilians during or after military operations. They are also providing armed guards for places where the victims are temporarily held and are also in charge of their transportation to the final destinations. A high-ranking PDF commander from Kadugli, the Nuba Mountains area, confirmed to me, for example, during an official meeting in 1993, that his troops are given orders to collect and transport civilians from the rebel-held areas to government of the Sudan-run refugee camps after taking over these villages from the rebels. There is evidence also on cases when army officers captured and brought with them to northern Sudan Southerner children as servants in their households. The vast majority of the victims are women and children belonging to ethnic, racial, and religious minorities from southern Sudan and indigenous African tribes from the Nuba Mountains area. Women and girls are used as concubines or are forced to work for soldiers. Several cases of rape were reported even in camps for displaced run by the government of Sudan or organizations working with the government of the Sudan in the Kordovan area. Boys and young men are used mainly as servants. There are reports, and my own findings in the Nuba Mountains confirm these reports, that a number of people are obliged to work on large agricultural schemes run by individual landowners close to the government of the Sudan. The most exposed of all these categories of victims are members of the Dinka tribe living in northern Bahr al-Ghazal, especially the Dinka Gogrial. I received, during my September 1993 visit to Wau, the capital of the former Bahr al-Ghazal state, dramatic eyewitness accounts on these practices. In the camps for displaced Dinka, situated around Wau, I have talked to people, mainly women, children, and elderly, who were in the worst shape I have ever seen human beings in my life. Inhuman and degrading treatment of the victims by their captors is widespread. Many victims of the mentioned violations and abuses are forcibly converted to Islam and are given Arabic names, but even with that, in many instances, their treatment is not improved at all. Local and central authorities are all well aware of this phenomena. In a number of cases, relatives of those abducted or local chiefs are making serious efforts to retrieve their relatives, sometimes with success. Local authorities are usually contacted but do not intervene, even if the owner is identified and his name is indicated. In a few instances, deals were reached between the owner or the captor and the claimants, and victims were released for compensation in money or goods. It is to be noted, however, that according to the Sudanese Criminal Act of 1991, abduction, kidnapping, forced labor, unlawful confinement, and unlawful detention are considered crimes. I am not aware, however, of any trial by a Sudanese court in such cases during the past years. It is also to be mentioned that the Sudan is for decades a signatory party to both the 1926 Slavery Convention and the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the Slave Trade, and Institutions and Practices Similar to Slavery, dated 1956. Taking into account all these circumstances, I cannot but repeat my conclusions from the last report to the UN General Assembly in November 1995, duly reiterated in my latest report released yesterday in Geneva. The abduction of persons, mainly women and children belonging to racial, ethnic and religious minorities from Southern Sudan, their subjection to the slave trade, including trafficking and sale of children and women, slavery, servitude, forced labor and similar practices are taking place with the knowledge of the government of the Sudan. The manifest passivity of the government of the Sudan in this regard, after years of reporting and calls upon it by United Nations organs and international non-governmental organizations affiliated with the United Nations, and the subsequent lack of any measures to protect Sudanese citizens from these practices, lead to the conclusion that abductions, slavery, and institutions similar to slavery are carried out by persons acting under the authority and with the tacit approval of the government of the Sudan. The fact that the abductions take place mostly in a war-affected area is to be considered as a particularly aggravating circumstance in this case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And I'd like to now ask Dr. Vigilante if he would present his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for having me here and for holding these hearings. They're critically important. Today, rather than giving extensive testimony, I'm going to show a brief video that I took when I was in the Sudan approximately 12 months ago. I'll just say a few words as by way of preface. I went as a representative of the Puebla Institute, now part of Freedom House, to investigate reports of slavery and the forced incarceration of children and other reports that these children were being sent to the battlefront. My sources were children themselves who had escaped, parents and families of these children, clergy and international NGOs who work there, and I spoke to members of the Sudanese government as well. As I alluded to, I snuck a video camera into the country and in safe houses and basements was able to gather testimony from about 6 hours worth of testimony, of which we're going to see a few minutes here. And I also ventured out my last day there, about 400 kilometers into the desert, to see a camp that did hold at one point 228 kids who subsequently have disappeared. We don't know where they went. By way of that introduction, perhaps we can show the tape, and then if I could make a few comments after the tape and then respond to any questions. Thank you.
And please do. And without objection, your full testimony will be made part of the record.
Of course, one of the invariable rules of the universe is that these things don't come off on the first try. While we're waiting, maybe I made a couple of comments. I think that, what I felt I was able to document while I was there was really three forms of slavery. One is, comes out of a tribal tradition that is exploited by the government. The government in the 80s armed Arab tribes quite heavily in their battle against the black African tribes, particularly the Dinka, and certainly encouraged them to keep the spoils of war, including children that they took in that conflict. And these children are now enslaved in great numbers by their Arab masters. The second version is of slavery occurs directly at the hands of government agents, the Popular Defense Forces in particular, who were alluded to previously. These mujahideen, or warriors of the jihad, are poorly paid or not paid at all, and once again take children and women as part of their compensation. The third phenomenon, which I found the most disturbing, was the systematic. Are we go here? Okay, I'll stop. Fortunately, people here can't see it. I don't know. Can we turn that this way so we can? Can Mr. Johnson?
Can Congressman Payne see the?
Children of tribal band number 13. The woman became infected and left a disfiguring scar. The master was cited. Was he did he put any marks or numbers on her? Saying he was too young. We then escaped. Were you in the army? Yeah? Yes? This servant was filmed in the basement of a church where we arranged a secret meeting with dissidents. They introduced members of the family who had converted to Christianity, a crime punishable by death. Here they described the recent persecution of an elder in their community. The young still Saturday, the investigation is for the government, giving some best start to Islam, they provide. So they tried to do a crucifixion. Yeah. They tried to. Yes. They tried to. They are not violent to not any of them getting bad. So the judge was informed and ordered the Honorable to give them very well. Without blessing to beat them. So he started in the 80 beats, each lashes? Yeah, each. How many people were we talking about here? 4 people. 4 or 3 others. Yes. And how old was the battle? Yes, 72. Yes. So they were going to fly a 72-year-old man? Yes. This Muslim woman did not like to show her face on camera as a former journalist expelled from the country. She spoke in great detail about slavery and showed us the location of high-security children's camps. She also spoke about the forced impregnation of black women by Arab soldiers. They said they have the authority to kill, to rob, to misappropriate, to do anything, and nobody has the right to ask them. Nobody will prosecute them. Nobody will prosecute them. No. For example,
there are women here in a camp in Abbasiyah. Many Shah women were taken, women from Shah were taken here, and their children were taken here for slavery. These women here, 300 women were pregnant firstly by the Popular Defense Forces and Vigilante, because any who succeeds to pregnate 4 women is given 10,000 pounds reward.
The ruling party is the National Islamic Front, a radical fundamentalist group that is detested and feared by most of the population. Unaware of the camera, an Arab Muslim taxi driver expresses with unusual candor his contempt for this regime. So you like the government or not? This government? Yeah, I don't like it. Why? I can't face it. Yeah, everybody don't like it. Everybody doesn't like it. Yeah. Why? He's not good. Not the one that if you're not was free, like Islamic, we don't do nothing here. But you're Islamic. But you're Islamic. Islamic, but there's not Islamic. We have a first class and second class. Of course. I see. We're the good man, the second class. The second class is Islamic. Yeah. We say so. We say so. I'm Islamic. But Allah, I do try and do things and okay. It's Islamic. But he's saying Islamic number 1, number 2. Is it a different Islam? You practice a different way? In myself, I don't think so. I have a difference. The Islamic is a difference. I see. And how about the you to talk at the Qurani, we'll let you know about it. It goes on to demonstrate how young children are abducted from vessels and pressed into military service. They take them out of the bus? They take them out of the bus? Yeah. Why? Did we discuss now? Yeah. Stop it. Look at the kids, my boys. Saying that they burn out the mom to the job or to go someplace, it's the kid getting out. If you come back home again. But the security is there, yeah. The government is rounding up young black children by the thousands and putting them in high-security cultural cleansing camps where they are given new Arabic names, undergo forced Islamization and military training, and are then sent off to war. This ITF footage is a rare look at one of these camps. To visit one of these children's camps myself. So my last day in the city, I rented a car and a driver and drove 400 kilometers into the desert where an informant told me a camp existed. Almost by sheer luck, we succeeded in finding the camp. There we met their 2 only grounds. I succeeded in gaining their confidence, and they told me that 228 boys ages 11 to 15 had been there but were taken away on September 9th. But we do not know if they were sent off to battle in the Civil War. As we spoke, the camera was rolling in my bag, picking up on the audio. I asked them if I could take their pictures. Because the video camera looked like a conventional camera, I pretended to be taking still photos, but got images of this vacant children's camp in the background.
Well, I apologize for the quality of the audio there. I know it's very difficult to understand, but the point was that, you know, early on there were testimony from a number of children who had been taken from their parents and put in these high security camps, and one child said that he was slated to go off to battle, and it was only by intervention of a military officer that he did not. These kids are rounded up, in kashas, whereby a truck comes into a marketplace and they round up all the black African-appearing children. And I want to make a comment about this because Ms. McKinney asked before, what is the role of color in this whole conflict? Because if you talk to leaders of the Sudanese government, and let me tell you, they're very sophisticated. Tarabi was educated in Oxford. The Minister of Information, a fellow named Shengeti, got a PhD from Boston University a few years ago, and they really know how to talk to Westerners and put the spin on their story. And they'll say to you, look, I mean, we're not racist. Look, I'm black. Look at the color of my skin. And they're saying, why would we be racist against other people of our own country who are also black? But the Sudan is a unique racial environment. The Nile, over centuries, has mixed genes from one end of the country to the other, so that you have a gradual gradation of color from light to very dark, and it blends almost imperceptibly. But at the extremes, you can clearly see differences. And after a very short time there, it was very easy for me as a foreigner to know who was a Dinka, who was a Shilluk, who was a Nur, who was from the Arab North, by just looking. And if I can make those types of perceptual judgments, it's easy for the natives to do. And it didn't take me long to realize that there's a whole hierarchy in that country based on race and tribal associations, and that the people of the South, the black Africans, are the people who are victimized by racism and by slavery. And I think people who deny that are not being truthful about their attitudes towards race in the country of Sudan. I'll just close there and be available for questions later.
Dr. Vigilante, thank you very much for your testimony. Dr. Lado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chairman, members on the distinguished panel, and the members, my colleague members on the panel, and the audience. I'm really very grateful that finally the issue of slavery in Mauritania and Sudan has received a hearing in this institution. Three years ago, we made an informal visit. We knocked on a number of congressmen's offices to really cry out about this issue of slavery. We as Pax Sudani, and I must also say that the Sudanese have always actually been speaking out in various forums, about the fact that slavery exists in their country. The difficulties that we have faced over, until very recently is that we simply have not been very successful in getting, a receptive ear until very recently. And for that, I'm very, very grateful that, this hearing hopefully would generate a momentum for the ongoing abolitionist movement in this country. Now, to get right to the issue, I have, produced my statements, and rather than going, through the full text, I'll simply overview and provide the discussion that we have had so far in context. I think by the time we leave here, we will not, walk out contesting the issue of slavery. It's a very, very clear-cut situation. And as a Sudanese, I would like to say that this system has really completely ransacked, devastated families. It has destroyed villages. It has destroyed ethnic groups. It has destroyed nationalities, all in the South Sudan, in the Nuba Mountains, in the Ngesana Hills. We are dispersed throughout the world, largely because of this issue of slavery. The other point to make is that the connection between the institution of slavery, the perpetrators of slavery, and the Africans who are being enslaved has had a very long, extensive historical, antecedent, and I have provided some highlights in my, in my report, and that all these African groups, whether being Dinka or Shilluk or Nuer and so forth, and I come from the right south of the country, from Kajukaji. We do not know of any of our oral tradition that speak to a culture, of slavery. So simply to say that, that Sudanese, Africans are also involved in slavery, as some of the allegations that are coming forth, is simply not true. That the process of enslaving has always come from the north and continues to, to hit, very, very forcefully and brutally down south, and and if not really stamped out, will destroy the entire continent. The other point that I also want to make is that the connection between chattel slavery and institutional forms of slavery has to be emphasized. It has to be emphasized because it is at the institutional level that the government becomes, wholly responsible and connected. That there are acts of sale of human beings. I cannot emphasize it enough. The evidence has already been provided. But the government, and actually I must say successive governments over the years in the Sudan have created a context that allow for this system to, to flourish. And that context is revealed more recently in the declaration of jihad against the non-Muslim in the country, but also against Muslims who simply do not happen to, to believe in the faith of the ruling group. And that is also reflected in the first conversion of non-Arabs into Arab. And that is also reflected in race. So these three factors more, collectively conspire to create an ideology that has sustained, slavery over the years. And I think this is very important, because we can only, talk about ending slavery if we understand it in its, comprehensive context. And my colleagues on the panel have already, indicated instances in which black Sudanese are targeted, for slavery, and the hierarchy of this, slavering process. And the fact of the matter is that, if you're an Arab, a non-black Arab who is a Muslim, there is simply no question of, slavery. In fact, that is the enslaving group. And as the combination, and permutation proceeds, a non-Arab who is a non-Muslim clearly, is the target, for the slavery. An Arab and a Muslim who is black, who happens to believe in African indigenous cultures and languages, is also a target of slavery. And we see that in the Nuba Mountains, where the entire region has been sealed off and it's targeted for elimination. And before I move to the recommendation, I also want to emphasize the connection between slavery and genocide, because I think the Lady Cox brought that forth, but I also want to emphasize that in terms of specific acts, we know that right from the 60s in the Sudan, there were two clear, genocidal incidences: the Juba massacre, and there was a massacre in Wau. And in the 80s, 87, there was the Dien massacre, in which nearly 2,000 Dinka men and women and children were killed, and nearly 7,000 were captured and sold into slavery. And these are, especially in the case of Dien and a Jebelen massacre, a massacre that in which Africans working on Arab farmlands were actually, forced, to work on Sunday, which they as Christians regard as the day, their day of rest, and they were subjected to, severe torture and massacre. Now, all those acts of, of genocide have actually had a, consistency, over the years in the regimes. So when we talk about the current slavery that's going on in the Sudan, it is perpetuated by this psychology, this ideology that basically makes one particular group subhuman clearly and therefore a target of enslavement. Now, the question then is what should be done? I think what should be done is we have consistently argued that the situation now, calls for much more vigorous action on the part of the world community, and more specifically this country, because it clearly has leadership, it clearly has, has the force, it could actually have the will. We know that the country, Sudan, has actually been listed, on the list of terrorist nations, and it is because of this institution, the Congress, that moved swiftly to pass a resolution to put the country on the list of terrorist nations. And it is with that kind of force and swiftness that we believe that the issue of slavery should be given attention. It should be given attention because the terrorism that the country is involved, the current regime is involved externally, is also being actually imposed on the people internally, with impunity. I want to just say one thing about the embargo, the comprehensive sanctions. There was a response by the Assistant Secretary of, State this afternoon, how sanctions would hurt the civilian population, how, the problem of war, the situation is so complex. I must emphasize that millions of our own people have, perished over the years. Thousands more are in conditions of slavery. How much more suffering can the world, expect of the population, in order to not justify imposing, comprehensive sanctions? The other side of the matter too is that if the world remains passive and aloof and, distant on the issue of sanctions, we know that the Sudan government cannot continue to fuel, to provide the fuel, the wherewithal, the firepower, the economics to sustain the slavery within the country without external support. And it is in this context that, comprehensive sanctions would really begin to address the issue of the slavery in the Sudan more comprehensively. I will end here and, look forward to, to answering questions.
Thank you very much, Lado, and your comments on sanctions, I think, were very well taken, and I know this particular member supports them. I think until the international community gets very serious and begins linking human rights with trade, the prospects for curbing this abusive behavior are very slim indeed. And so I think we need to, put our money where our mouth is, and if it means, as we saw with apartheid, there's a short-term economic deprivation, but the overwhelming evil then has an opportunity of being eradicated. And I think that's where many of us who are very strongly in favor of human rights and linking human rights with trade come down. There is a short-term pain, there's no doubt about it, for some. So I appreciate your comments. In looking over the recommendations that you've all made, and Dr. Bíró, I know that based on what I've been reading about what you've been doing, it has gotten worse, at least the slavery and the abuses since your mandate was established in 1993. And I wonder if you could tell us first, what has been the reaction to the international community? When you make your reports, I remember my disappointment when I was in Geneva working with our then Ambassador Armando Valladares on human rights matters, the seeming indifference and the mouthing of words by some in the international community. But when it came down to actually doing something, they preferred endless dialogue with the offending nation as opposed to some significant action. What has been your response when you make your reports vis-a-vis the Sudan and the atrocities being committed there, the slavery? How does the international community respond to the reports that you make?
You are perfectly right, Mr. Chairman. since I'm dealing with this mandate, I undertook this mandate, the situation is continuously deteriorating, not only with regard to slavery and similar practices, but the all-over situation, the whole situation regarding human rights. Well, there are so far 6 reports on the situation, which I presented to the Commission on Human Rights and to the General Assembly. There are 5 resolutions adopted following the debate on these reports. In these resolutions, 3 by the General Assembly and 2 by the Commission on Human Rights, my conclusions and recommendations were incorporated. These conclusions and the recommendations partly are addressed to the government of the Sudan and partly to the international community. Those recommendations calls upon the government of the Sudan are totally ineffective. It's a complete disregard from behalf of the government to any international criticism, comment, recommendation, or whatever. A practical step, if I may say so, was undertaken last March when the Commission adopted one of my recommendations regarding the placement of full-time human rights monitors in such locations which would allow to facilitate and to improve the flow of information. We have a resolution from last March and the General Assembly resolution in backing and strengthening this Commission on Human Rights resolution. This has, unfortunately, nothing happened until this moment. For bureaucratic reasons, for financial reasons, I don't know, I cannot find out, nobody can find out in the Center for Human Rights in Geneva what is happening here in New York. The fact is that in 1 year we were not able to advance at all in implementing this operation. I would like to emphasize that this is a modest operation, a small-scale operation. We would place 3 monitors only in some of the neighboring countries with many Sudanese refugees and the continuous flow of Sudanese refugees coming out from Sudan, not only for the purpose of reporting on what's happening, gathering information, reports, etc. According to my experience, the presence of United Nations experts, employees dealing with human rights, humanitarian questions in the South regarding other parties to the conflict than the government of the Sudan has a beneficial role, a preventive role. For instance, the use of child soldiers was characteristic until 93, 94 by the SPLA in the South. Now, after reporting continuously on this phenomena, SPLA leaders signed last year a unilateral undertaking, signed an agreement containing a unilateral undertaking with Operation Lifeline Sudan and UNICEF working in Nairobi, through which undertaking they expressed they wish to abide by the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. As one practical consequence of this unilateral undertaking, UNICEF is getting involved in reunification, family reunification process of unaccompanied minors in the South. Some 800 children have been during the past few months reunited. The other scope of this human rights monitoring was to try to build up for the future some sort of the germs of a technical assistance operation program, a human rights training program, which is needed and asked by these people. So these are only the few aspects which are very practical, very much needed. I think that it would function very efficiently, but so far we are blocked and we cannot start this operation, as I said before, for bureaucratic reasons. The situation is worsening. According to a recent report which I received a few weeks before, research done in November-December 1995 in 20 camps for displaced in Kordovan area and the Nuba Mountains indicates that a number of 9,034 children are being kept in these camps and are subjected to an Islamization process. And this is only one report on one particular area, but there are many other reports from all over Southern Sudan and the north. I hope that this monitoring activity would bring some practical results. Now, it would be outside of the scope of my mandate to go further and to propose in my reports at least sanctions, embargo, etc. I would stay with this monitoring operation, and I would like to underline again the efficiency and the need for this operation. I have also some other proposals for the future in my mind, but I would like to stay with this.
I have some additional questions, but I'd like to yield. Oh, Dr. Vigilante.
Well, there is a number of recommendations that Freedom House would like to put forward. If I could read them into the record.
That'd be fine.
Okay. We feel the President should ensure that a directive is immediately issued to the Immigration and Naturalization Service acknowledging mounting persecution against Christians and non-Muslims in Sudan, as well as other countries, and instructing INS officers to process the claims of escapees from such persecution with priority and diligence. The INS has shown a general indifference towards Christians fleeing Sudan who are seeking asylum because of religious persecution. A Sudanese Catholic, whom I'll name M for his own safety, has been detained in the U.S. for the last 3 years while his case is being processed. Mr. M, with aid workers, missionaries, in particular Mr. Mark Ganner, is a translator in Southern Sudan. When Sudanese authorities executed Mark Ganner in 1992, Catholic Bishop Farid Taban advised Mr. M that his life was in danger and should flee Sudan. An INS court has denied Mr. M's request for asylum, partly based on his failure to explain the doctrine of transubstantiation. He is currently appealing this decision. That this Christian should be encountering such difficulties in obtaining asylum in the U.S. is an outrageous injustice. Second, UN Ambassador Madeleine Albright, apropos of what Mr. Bíró was saying, should closely monitor and press for the effective implementation of a potentially important new program in Sudan by the UN Children's Agency, UNICEF. Under international pressure from the publication of the Pueblo Report and the Special Rapporteur's findings, Sudan allowed UNICEF to initiate last fall a family reunification program for boys who had been abducted and detained in the cultural cleansing camps for juveniles described in my testimony. UNICEF has experienced many delays in proceeding with the program and is confining its work to only one camp. The U.S. should ensure that UNICEF's work in this regard is thorough and expedient, and work to expand the project to retrieving and reuniting with their families sold into slavery. Lastly, the administration should ensure that the issue of slavery of the basic type practiced in Sudan today is raised at all future international and United Nations forums where the protection of women, children, and minorities is raised. Last fall at the UN Fourth Women's Conference held in Beijing, the administration passed by an important opportunity for the issue of slavery in the Sudan to be addressed. Though women are one of the principal victims of the slave trade in the Sudan, chattel slavery was not an issue of discussion or even a key word in the document adopted at the World Conference on Women. In over 120 pages of the Platform for Action, slavery is only referred to as sexual slavery. Nothing was mentioned concerning the very real slave trade that takes place in the Sudan today. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just for the record, this subcommittee has jurisdiction over the refugee budget. Just yesterday, we passed the conference report, and we worked hard over the last year to ensure that an adequate amount of money was authorized, and we've also worked with the appropriators. It has been essentially straight-lined from last year when everything else is going down. We got a modest increase to $671 million for refugees. I greatly fear that this administration and some in Congress on both sides of the aisle are looking to close our doors to honest refugees. It doesn't surprise me one iota, because we have found that the administration and has shown this insensitivity to the Sudanese Christians who are being persecuted. We have found that to be, regrettably, part and parcel of the way this administration, and perhaps the previous ones as well, have treated Christians and others who are fleeing religious persecution. Much of yesterday's bill was filled with important directives and policy statements on refugee policy, because this administration wants to, like I said, and some Democrats and Republicans, close our doors. We have a major challenge facing us on the immigration bill. Some would like to cap refugees at 50,000, which would be an absurdity when so many people are seeking freedom. So we will work on that, and I thank you for this recommendation. And
thank you for your work.
Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, if she could respond.
Thank you. Baroness, I have a few questions for you, but first I'd like to thank the testimony that we've heard here today. I think it's very important for all of the Congress to know the sad situation that is going on, reality that the major media has really ignored for far too long, and we thank you for having the courage to bring it to light here. Baroness, in your testimony you had stated that UN organizations operate in places like Sudan only with the permission of the host government. Do you think that the United States and the United Kingdom should seek a change in that policy? And if you could give us some insight into that.
So thank you very much, because I think this is a very important challenge that confronts nations such as our own. You're probably aware that it's the principles on which major aid organizations such as the United Nations, UNHCR, UNICEF, International Committee of the Red Cross operate, that they can, according to their principles, only go to areas with the permission of a sovereign government. That means when you have a sovereign government that is repressing an ethnic or religious minority, then they don't give those invitations, and those people are entirely cut off, not only from aid, but also from a voice or advocacy that goes with the aid. Now, in Sudan, that has at least two very serious consequences. One is that in those areas, for example, in Southern Sudan, where the regime designates certain airstrips as no-go areas, and also the Nuba Mountains, those people there are often displaced by the war, often their crops have been burnt, they are suffering from starvation, and in the places where we go and camp, people, and it's a phrase I hate to use, but it's just what it's like, people are literally dying like flies of hunger and disease around us. You know, people will die in front of our eyes, ghost villages, people already dead, or the survivors just eating grass to stop the cramps in their stomach from hunger, and dying of treatable disease and no medicines available. So very often they may be forced off their land, and therefore it's part of the politics of hunger to lead to their displacement off their land, and they may be driven, maybe often for the sake of their children, to government garrisons or to the peace camps which we've heard about, or to the north, in order just to get the means of survival. Now, that fits with the regime's policy of enforced Islamization and also sometimes enforced Arabization, because conditions for receiving the aid which they need to survive include renouncing their Christian names, their religion, and adopting Muslim names, Muslim practices, and also sometimes forced sexual relationships with Arab soldiers or Arab owners, which of course is part of the ethnic assault on their African identity. Now, one of the things that concerns me about the policies which we seem to have, if not accepted, but at least have been working with, is that we have no accountability from the point of view of the money which we give towards aid organizations. That if we allow aid which we fund from Britain or from the United States to be used by the government or to be intercepted and used by Arabic Muslim aid organizations which are tools of the government, then we are actually condoning or conniving with this policy. We've been in the camps, for example, where we've seen aid which originated by Western donor organizations having been intercepted and not followed through by Western or original donor charitable organizations and abused in this way. And I would like to emphasize the principle of accountability, that if we give money, if we give aid in kind, or if NGOs do so, then we should see it right through to the feeding center, we should see it right through to the clinic, and not allow it to be taken and used by other intermediate aid organizations. So the accountability is crucial, and also I would emphasize we should be challenging this principle of no-go areas which lead to starvation and lead to displacement.
You had mentioned that some of those shipments of humanitarian goods get stopped and diverted. What are some of the other problems and obstacles that humanitarian aid organizations have encountered in trying to provide relief in southern Sudan?
Well, the main problem is this problem of access to the areas. Clearly, there are logistical problems in many parts which are created by natural conditions of access in terms of weather during the rainy season, reaching people in need and so on. But I think those problems could be overcome now. I think the SPLA has got a very good system, administrative system, and other areas within the south, that if access was allowed to all the areas where the people are in need, where there are airstrips, where there are roads, we could greatly reduce both the displacement and also the deaths from starvation and treatable disease. Just one other point, this policy of no-go areas imposed by the regime actually increases the enormous numbers dying of starvation and disease, because if you have an area which is an open area and people from the surrounding areas know that there is aid, medicine, food available there, they will come in order to get what they need to survive, and then it suddenly goes off the accepted list and becomes a no-go area. Many of those people are just stranded. Very often they're too weak to go back to their original land, and so they just die where they are. And so that's another aspect of this no-go area that has got to be challenged by nations such as our own.
Did you see the welcoming committee that you had in front of the Longworth building this afternoon chanting your name?
No,
Do you get those kinds of receptions? Do you know protests from organized groups against your humanitarian mission in Sudan?
Well, one of the problems perhaps of going to areas which are denied access by sovereign regimes is you're not the most popular person with the sovereign regime. But on the other hand, you have the great privilege of being with people who are in desperate situations. And one of the, if you can call it, one of the most poignant aspects of our work is when we go to those no-go areas and people come as you arrive and they say, we're so grateful you've come, we thought the world had forgotten us. And indeed, the world had forgotten them. It's one reason why we're very grateful to you for holding this hearing here this afternoon, that we can speak about some of those people who are so forgotten and so neglected.
Well, we thank you, and we thank all of the panelists who appeared before us for telling the world what needs to be, what we all need to hear and see, even though we want to ignore it and we want to not see it and we want to not hear it. It's there, and we have the power to help out those people, and I hope that we will. We thank you for all the good work that all of you have done.
Thank you.
Mr. Wolf?
I don't have any questions. I want to thank both of you, the two chairwomen, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who's been a hero on these issues, and I'm pleased that you're involved, and Congressman Smith, who I've traveled with on a number of places, to have both of you doing this hearing is very, very impressive. I think it will probably, I'm more optimistic today than I have any other time, because we've had a hard time getting the Congress to really kind of focus. You've had a good hearing. Both of the panels have been excellent, so I want to thank both of you. I also want to thank the previous panel. I don't know if they're still here, most of them on the panel. And I also want to thank this panel, Dr. Lado, Dr. Vigilante, for taking the time to go in, Dr. Bíró, for your courageous work, Baroness Cox, who I have the greatest respect for all of your good work, CSI, Christian Solidarity International, for your good work for sponsoring this, Freedom House for the good effort, because if it weren't for your two groups, frankly, I don't know that very much would be done. Lastly, I want to go on record to say I'm very disappointed in the Clinton administration. Big hat, no cattle, talk a lot of activity on this thing, do fundamentally almost nothing. And I am hopeful and prayerful, and that if there's a change in the administration, I would hope that this administration wouldn't wait until there's a change, would take some action with regard to this issue. But I want to pledge that if President Dole is elected, one of the first times I'm going to ask to meet with them and ask Ileana and Chris Smith to go with me, whereby we talk to Mr. Dole on this issue, so that if there is a Dole administration, that his State Department will be aggressive on this issue. If there isn't a Dole administration and it's Clinton again, that whoever he brings in to change this State Department is aggressive on this issue. I think Dr. Lado said it right. How many times do we have to wait? More people dying a death, more people in prison, and more people in slavery. I mean, the thought of slavery in Mauritania and Sudan in modern day, it's hard to get even people to believe it, because they thought that happened years and years ago. So I am committed to staying with this issue as long as I can, and the fact that we have 2 new people that are involved, I appreciate it very much. And frankly, and I mean this quite seriously, if Dole is elected president, the first meeting that I ask to speak with him is to speak with him on this issue. And I know that Mr. Dole is very, very sensitive. He's been sensitive to the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. He's been sensitive in the Bosnian thing. He's been sensitive with regard to Cuba. And I know he will be sensitive on this issue. Again, I thank you very much. I thank the Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Wolf. And Mr. Wolf really has been a leader on issues of human rights, and particularly in Sudan and Ethiopia, was one of the few who actually went there during some of the famines, and has been a conscience for the Congress, and I do thank him for his work. I do have a question for you, Dr. Lado, on your call to action and one of your specific recommendations. One of the answers arrived at rather belatedly with regards to Bosnia, that when the 2 factions, absolutely simply 3 factions, decided they would not get along, the international community imposed a partitioning along ethnic lines. Now, some would argue that that's a reward, particularly for the Serbs, for the terrible fruit of their ethnic cleansing, which was a despicable reminder of what the Nazis did. And you're recommending a partitioning as a way of providing a safe haven for the Southern Sudanese. How has that call been received? And I would wonder if the other panelists might want to respond to that as perhaps the only way of protecting the South from this cultural imperialism and the imposition of the Muslim religion on them.
Well, I would say in terms of reception, the regional mediating organization, IGAD, has actually coded the principle of self-determination for the people of South Sudan, the Nuba Mountains, and in Gersana Hills as one of the most fundamental bases upon which, a long-lasting peace and justice in the Sudan can actually be accomplished. Our call for a partitioning of the country as a way of ensuring a governance mechanism which ensures that future slavery, current and future slavery will not take place in that nation, really is motivated by the fact that, as I had indicated in my statement, in my presentation before, that slavery has always been the underpinning, cause for the wars in the Sudan, and they've always dated back to the Arab invasion, into the country. And as I said, the march, of this war and imperialism has actually been one way, down the Nile south. So the call really, in one respect, is a self-preservation. For one, the dignity of the people who are targeted for slavery is completely jeopardized, and for 2, there is genocide in a very, very overt and in a covert way, in the sense of cultural genocide. So, our call is motivated by the fact that slavery existed in historical times, during imperialism, colonialism. It existed in successive Arab regimes, past Arab regimes. It is spreading, in the present regime at a very alarming rate, as has been indicated in the testimony. And therefore, we believe that a call for a partitioning of the country would actually at least deliver, the people of those regions out of bondage. The international community still needs to be, to be sensitized, to this issue.
Would it take a peacemaking force to establish this buffer zone, or a peacekeeping force?
I think that in my thinking, first, this government, the Congress, should continue to support the regional initiative under IGAD, because the call for self-determination is, as I indicated, included in that, and that a regional mediating body of Africans and so forth, it's a very genuine and noble cause. And we believe that through that process, some good may actually come. However, if, as it has been shown by the Sudanese government in the past, that they have been very intransigent and they are a prior state, and they are willing to do anything with impunity, if peace efforts fail through those regional mechanisms, then we had indicated in our earlier recommendation that a peacekeeping body, international body, would have to, get into Sudan to deliver the people from bondage, just in the case of Rwanda and and Somalia,
Could I just,
Baroness Cox?
Thank you very much. Just add very quickly to that and support it. But just to say that in my recommendations, I think it would be very helpful if the international community supported the principles of the IGAD initiative, which include the principle of self-determination, and also supported the Sudanese democratic opposition groups, and they come together under the umbrella of the NDA, and the NDA has already agreed a program for self-determination to be decided by the peoples of Sudan themselves after a 4-year period. So I think really it's for the peoples of Sudan to decide that future for themselves, and for us to support them in their own democratic programs towards that decision.
Either of you like to?
Well, no, I mean, I think that the IGAD, agreements are really the foundation for progress here in terms of self-determination. I mean, it's hard to know how long this current regime is viable. It doesn't have large popular support of the country, and in some ways things seem to be crumbling around them, and yet they're durable. And when they're gone, it's hard to know what will follow, whether things will be better or not. So I'm reluctant to talk about, to sort of blankly advocate partition, but I think at least a dialogue based around self-determination, I think, is the kind of dialogue that should go forward.
The support for a peaceful democratic dialogue has been constantly one of my recommendations, and I was calling for a support from the international community, the IGAD process. So I fully agree with Baroness Cox.
The estimates on the number of children who are in these camps being brainwashed, how long do they normally stay in a camp? How many? 9,000 was one estimate that I think was offered earlier. And when UNICEF was able to retrieve some of these children, how long were those kids in? I mean, did they get some long-term internees, or is it something that happens overnight, or,
It's very difficult to know, because the nature of the camps are very heterogeneous, and you can have one there seems to be one in Soba, which is not far from Khartoum, which seems to be like a staging camp where kids who are first rounded up, taken, some kids are, street kids, but some kids are just taken from their parents, and they go to this camp in Soba, and they be there for a number of weeks, and then they're sent to another camp in a much more remote part of the country, like the one I visited in Fao. And there are various estimates of how many camps there are, from orders of magnitude of scores of camps to hundreds of camps, and and they're varying different sizes. and they come in and go out of existence in a fairly fluid way. This particular one that I went to was empty at the moment, but clearly there were guards there, so they had plans for it for the future. But two kids that I know that were in a camp, when retrieved by their mother through very persistent activity, they were wearing the damorilla, which is the traditional garb of the PDF. They had numbers on them. And one child's number was 4,000 something, something, something. So, does that indicate that there were 4,000 kids through that one camp? It's hard to know, but there are conservative estimates are many tens of thousands of children are involved.
In the recommendation, Dr. Bíró?
Regarding the number, it's difficult indeed to estimate the number of children in these camps, but it's not impossible. My estimate is that the number is higher than 10,000.
10,000?
Than 10,000. It's higher.
No, higher. I said tens of thousands,
yeah,
many tens of thousands.
It's higher than 10,000. This is a very careful estimate.
Boys and girls?
I'm sorry?
Boys and girls?
There are separate camps for boys and separate for girls. Now,
mostly boys, though.
Mainly boys are, of course. Regarding the period, the official response from behalf of the government of Sudan, which I received when I asked this question, was 1 year. These children are kept 1 year, are given vocational training, quote unquote, but no response regarding what happens after. Now there are persistent reports that children between 10 and 15 years are sent to the battlefield after a short training, where, as I was told by sources from the south, they are simply cannon fodder because they are untrained and simply they are dying immediately in a crossfire or whatever. The existence of some of these camps is acknowledged or was acknowledged before by the government, but there is a practice of closing a few camps. When myself or human rights groups are reporting on specific camps, we found out later on that these camps were closed down, but other camps were opened in other places. This is what I...
Do we have any evidence that torture is used? We saw in the video kids being hit with what looked like some kind of whip.
I would say rather harsh punishment.
Solitary
confinement, punishments as used in the military, lashing. This is routine.
Do any kids die?
I have reports of kids dying in camps. Yes, I do have reports of 2 children dying in a camp in Dordib, and the treatment is apparently extremely harsh. The kid's father, I talked to a kid and his father, and beatings were a regular occurrence. Malnourished, cold, not very much sleep at night, and so it was, and plus going under the very real psychological trauma of being stripped of your name and being given a new identity, cultural identity, and then disappearing.
But does it last? I mean, here are kids that have been ripped away from their parents.
Right.
They may have a strong faith in Christ, for example. Do they act as if they're cooperating yet inwardly, or is the brainwashing so complete that they really do become another person?
It's a very strong ideological indoctrination, religious teaching, together with military training.
Do they turn their kids against their parents?
Well, one thing you have to realize, this is a very primitive place where things aren't done with great uniformity or efficiency. So you may find one environment that's run a certain way and another one that's very different depending on who happens to be there. Some of the children that I interviewed who came back, who got out, I would say, they kind of went along and kind of survived, but just went along to get along, and but reverted to their normal selves when they got back. But some of the kids aren't so fortunate as to get out.
Baroness Cox.
Just one variation on the theme of maltreatment of children, not so much children taken to the camps, but children put into chattel slavery. Our estimate of women and children from Southern Sudan in chattel slavery is in tens of thousands. We've had evidence from some of the children who've been taken and enslaved in that way, and they're used for a variety of purposes. They're often, it is slave labor. They're often maltreated. They're often given hardly enough to survive on in terms of food and nourishment. They are beaten. They may be used for domestic labor, especially girls, but they're also, even from the age of 9 upwards, used as concubines. The boys are often used to look after cattle or to work in pretty harsh conditions in agricultural labor, forced labor. And many of these, again, are also rooted out from their basic Christian tradition and background and lose their Christian names and are given Muslim names, forced to adopt Muslim practices. We have quite a few case studies in the testimony we left with you, which describe the suffering of some of these children who've managed to escape. So I think there's two variations on the theme of maltreatment of children, those who are used in the camps may be used for militia purposes and to fight against their own people in the south. Those are obviously boys, and both boys and girls who are used as chattel slaves.
Has the Sudanese government, has the Khartoum government acceded to the Convention on the Rights of the Child?
They've signed it, yes.
Oh, yes.
How then is that, how is that enforced? I mean, here it seems
total hypocrisy.
It's not.
Total hypocrisy. I mean, you know, when there is different kinds of camps there. You know, when I went and I pressed this issue with the Minister of Information there, and he said, well, yeah, well, of course we have plant camps for displaced people, and they're out in the outskirts of Khartoum, and you can go visit them, and you can go visit those camps. There's hundreds of thousands of people in the outskirts of Khartoum living in the most absolute squalor that you can imagine, and you can get into those camps. That's where the NGOs work. But these other camps that we're referencing right now are high security camps in remote areas that you cannot get to except under the most extraordinary circumstances. And I think when there is such secrecy, there is a presumption of guilt, that there's something to hide. And they will not admit to the existence. They wouldn't admit it to me. When I pressed the Minister of Information about these camps, he says, no, we don't have those kinds. We have some vocational training schools where we try to get kids back, but it doesn't jive with the evidence.
The only
yeah, I wanted to make to include one suggestion as a recommendation for the record, and that is that when I went through the research on this whole issue of anti-slavery movement and so forth, one of the 4 people in the movement, Greenwich, had indicated back in 1954 that in the whole campaign against slavery, he realized, and the